Pete Yost here for the Unbuild It podcast. We have two sponsors this week. First up is Aero Barrier, a new way to air seal homes. Aero Barrier uses a blower door to move non-toxic airborne sealant into all the nooks and crannies where air leaks occur in a building's shell. It's a completely performance-based air sealing system. You get to watch your blower door number drop as the sealant tightens up your building. This technology was first developed for sealing forced air duct systems. And when I heard that the same company was developing a system to seal homes, I was really skeptical. But I have watched highly skilled Aero Barrier technicians prep a home and run the Aero Barrier technology, and it is clear that both the technology and the installation are based on sound building science and a superior understandings of how buildings leak air. The Unbuild It podcast is proud to have Aero Barrier as a sponsor. Check out their air sealing system at www.aeroseal.com. Our next sponsor is Home Building Crossroads, an educational webinar series sponsored by Zip System Building Enclosures and Advantech Subfloor Assemblies, bringing the best speakers in the industry to discuss building science and help you walk away with real solutions to the building issues you're facing. Christine Williamson, president of Building Science Fight Club, will present her course, Airtight Done Right, on 2 dates in December, Tuesday, December 15th, and again on December 17th. Airtight Done Right highlights small design adjustments using standard materials that architects and builders can immediately make to improve airtightness and energy efficiency in residential design. For more information and to register, visit zipsystem.homebuildingcrossroads.com.
Welcome to the Unbuild It podcast. I'm Jake Bruton. I'm joined today by Peter Yost and
Hey there.
a guest that we're going to not introduce just yet. We're actually going to have a conversation about how we got to wanting to have our guest on today.
Cool.
How are you today, Peter?
Excellent. It's a beautiful day in Vermont. How about you?
Hi, same here. It's fantastic in Columbia. I think the high today might get to 90, but it's not that late summer humidity, 90 degrees. It's that early spring humidity.
Well, we're high of 75, so come visit us in Vermont, Jake.
Okay. So the reason we're being coy is because Peter and I actually came to this guest in what I thought was an interesting way. You guys know that Peter used to be with Building Green, and he and I were having a conversation about an article that was on Building Green by Alex Wilson, and I think the updated version also has, what's Paula's last name?
Paula Melton.
Melton. About transportation energy intensity of buildings. Now, the first time Peter said that to me, I was just like, yeah, I'm this is one of those I'm going to glaze over and not listen to what Peter says, because that title is strong. But the gist of that article is, what year was that building built, Peter? 2008, something like that, is the world's first LEED Platinum building, right?
Yeah, I don't know about 2008, but
okay.
Yeah.
But when that building was built, the world's first LEED Platinum building, Building Green looked at that and went, okay, but they moved that building away from where the people that work in that building live, and they moved it so that everybody that works there has to drive, or very little could actually get public transportation to it. And the idea that building was extremely energy efficiency and extremely well built is negated by the fact that everybody had to get into a gas guzzling car, get on the highway, and drive to wherever they work. And this is important for our industry and our conversation because, Peter, both you and I have read Bruce King's book lately, where he talks about it's too late. We all have to make a difference now in carbon impact. And his book focuses on construction and how making our buildings net zero carbon, not just net zero energy, has to happen now to reverse climate change and what's going on in the world. And I thought that Bruce King conversation is great, but that carbon negative building doesn't matter if it's 50 miles from where you live.
Yeah,
and people aren't really talking about that.
And, you know, we always talk about boundary conditions, like what's on the table and off the table. And when I was working at Building Green with Alex and Nadav, I would always get, you know, kind of irritated because they'd be constantly exploding the boundary conditions. Like, no, I want to focus. I want to look just at the building. And they would say, no, you can't do that because that's myopic. And, when Alex was researching this article, no one really knew exactly where the transportation energy intensity of buildings stood compared to, say, operational energy or embodied energy of the building. So it was kind of cool when he first picked up this topic, because we're just looking at bigger boundary conditions. And by the way, we're talking now soon with a guest whose expertise is way outside of our comfort area. So we're going to really give him a hard time, I guess.
Well, let's go ahead and say welcome, Jeff Speck.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
And I absolutely hate it when people read a bio and introduce anybody. And having listened to you speak, I think that I want you to introduce yourself, and then we'll continue our conversation from there. So take it away, Jeff.
Well, that's tough because I don't want to brag. And
we want
go
you
ahead.
to
My
brag.
my bio is very, as every bio pretends to be written by someone else, and it's completely boastful and lists every credential and everything else. Let's just say I was trained as an architect, but ended up getting involved in urban design, which led to city planning, and so I've been a city planner now with one break where I took 4 years and worked in the federal government as design director at the National Endowment for the Arts. But I've basically been a city planner now for about 25 years, and I was an early adherent to what became known as the new urbanism, which was this idea that we needed to completely reverse the pattern of the way we built for the past 50 years, essentially a single-use sprawl, right? Pods and clusters. So I was very early kind of on that bus, and ended up writing some books about it. I wrote a book with my mentors and colleagues, Andres Dwani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, called Suburban Nation, which was kind of one of the principal documents of the New Urbanist movement. And then I wrote a book more recently, 2012 it came out, called Walkable City, which became quite popular and changed the conversation. I like to think changed the conversation nationally about both how we build new communities, but even more so how we can make our cities just better places. So I write and I lecture and I go around the world and the country and try to explain to people how we've been building, really in the U.S. at least, we've been building places wrong for more than half a century, and we can do it the right way. And I have a new book called Walkable City Rules, which is much more of kind of a manual about how to get this stuff done.
Oh, cool.
But of course, I've always been interested in environmentalism, environmental building. There's a huge overlap between that and what I do. And in Walkable City, I talk about I've now expanded it to 5, but I talk about the 3 main reasons why we need to make our cities and communities more walkable, which include economic reasons and epidemiological reasons. But the third category is environmental reasons, and there's a lot of great writing, most of it quite recent, about, in fact, you can't be green without looking at the form of your city itself, and that's become a focus of my preaching around the world.
And your teaching as well, right?
I do some teaching, but mostly I try to spread the word to as many people as possible through lectures, and that's changed in the last 4 months.
Yeah.
However, usually every couple of weeks I'm giving a lecture somewhere to an audience of generalists, to folks who aren't planners or studying planning or architecture. Usually it's a community lecture. I might get 100, 200 people, sometimes more, trying people who want their communities to be more walkable.
Gotcha. You did, the only thing that disappoints me about the way you gave us your bio, Jeff, is you left out the subtitles for Walkable Cities and Walkable City Rules, which make me giggle.
Well, the subtitle for Suburban Nation was "The Rise of Sprawl and the Decline of the American Dream." The Walkable City subtitle is how downtown can save America
America
one step
at a time.
Boom. And then Walkable City Rules is 101 steps to making great places or something like that, better places.
Yep.
So yeah,
So,
I mean,
I like that little hint. Those are fantastic.
yeah, I think it's so important to find the right title, and I don't know if I did, but Walkable City. I think there's a lot to say about that as a title, but the main kind of intellectual step I've taken in my work, and certainly everything I've done I learned from other folks, but I essentially renamed New Urban. So what this reaction to sprawl, this attempt to both stop the decanting and the disinvestment of our inner cities and the creation of new places that were of single use and therefore entirely dependent upon the automobile. When my mentors first did it, they called it neo-traditional urbanism, which of course turned off the liberals like me. And then eventually it became a much more larger national conversation, which included the whole smart growth, side of things. And we started calling it new urbanism. I think a lot of us have just been calling it best practices in city planning or urban design for many years, but I started just calling it the walkable city. And calling it the walkable city makes it just so more accessible to folks and allows them to understand it better, communicate it with others better, allows me to sell it better. But also, strangely, I found that, and I do this in my books, of course, when I outline what makes places more walkable and forced myself to create a formula for figuring that out, it then caused me to apply that formula when I do projects. And now when I do projects with the principal goal of making walkable places, I would say it's transformed a little bit the design decisions I make when I view everything through that lens. It's a super effective kind of intellectual kind of orientation that allows me to do better planning, I think.
Yeah. And so the way that I came to be familiar with your work, I have an architect here locally that we were complaining about downtown, and we were complaining about the main road leading to downtown and the city wanting to widen it to 4 lanes to be able to bring more people in. And he said, you should read this book that came out a couple years ago. And he told me about it. And as with most people, when someone says you should read this book, your level of respect for that person weighs whether or not you read that book. And I felt like his motivation and my level of respect for him, I was like, okay, well, that's one that I actually am going to read. And so I got a copy of it probably 2015, 2016, and it changed a lot about the way that we thought about our business even. I decided then that we were going to try really hard to not build any houses in suburban neighborhoods that these neighborhoods that are annexed by the city but don't have any income outside of property tax that are draining the coffers. And it even took me to a point where my wife and I live 5 minutes or 10 minutes outside of town. And
walking.
Well, the current, we'll talk about walkscore.com in a little bit, but my current walk score at the house that we're in right now is 17. And we're building a house right now, and we bought a house as an infill lot as close to downtown as we could afford, and as close to our children's school as we could afford, and we're upping that walk score, and we're moving closer to town because of the ideas that take place in walkable cities.
Awesome. I get letters from folks who say, thanks to your books, I've moved, and I get many more letters from people who say, thanks to your books, I hate where I live and I'm miserable now.
So I wanted to ask about the difference between a city and a town, because Jake, you said closer to town, but what's the population of your city or town?
120,000 people.
Yeah, so like in Vermont, a big town or a small city is Brattleboro, which is 13,000 people. That's because the largest city in Vermont is Burlington at 63,000.
Yeah.
So Jeff, when you think about walkable cities, do you include towns, small towns,
Yeah,
as
I
part
think
of that?
the biggest. Let me first ask Jake, where do you live?
Columbia, Missouri.
Okay, yeah, that's a nice town or city. To answer your question,
Thank you.
so I think it's important to outline some terminology. It's not a mistake, but there's a correction I have to make whenever I talk, which is I'm always talking about downtown.
Mm-hmm.
And people think I mean naturally the central business district or the most intense part of their city. But actually, when I talk about downtown and fixing downtown, because most of the stuff that I want, most of the places where actual walkability is truly possible, and we'll talk about what real walkability is. Most of those places are downtown-ish, but that doesn't mean that they're the downtown of your city. It's essentially any neighborhood that's of mixed use, and except for very few new urbanist communities that have been built in the past 20 or 30 years, almost all of those are places that were born before 1940 and probably before 1930, and were originally principally areas of business, and that may have changed over time. But when I say downtown, and I'm probably going to say it a lot during this discussion, I mean those places of mixed use where there's both places to work and places to live, all in the same walkable framework. But Peter, to your question, it's really important to understand that because sometimes this becomes people misunderstand it and it becomes a political discussion with all of the ramifications of suburban housewives and everything else, a political discussion about city versus suburb, city versus town, town versus village.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to draw a very clear line and say, actually, we're talking about whether or not a place has neighborhood structure. And what neighborhood structure means is compact form, diversity of use, so mixed use, and walkability. That can happen in a village, which is typically a neighborhood standing alone in the landscape. It can happen in a town, which is a collection of neighborhoods usually, or a city, which is a collection of neighborhoods that's grown up, right? And or it could also, if we talk about form of governance, it could mean something else entirely. But when we say town, village, or city, we basically mean agglomerations of neighborhoods of that traditional mixed-use, walkable, diverse, and compact form. And so, actually, there are plenty of walkable suburbs that are fantastic, right? I grew up in one, Belmont, Massachusetts, just next to Cambridge, Mass, once part of Cambridge, Mass. My dad walked to work every day. I walked to school every day because it was pre-war, right? And there are plenty of unwalkable cities, places that we know that like Henderson, Nevada, or other places that are cities with hundreds of thousands of people in them, yet no one ever walks to anything. And so I think the principal distinction to make, and I hate to boil it down to a single form of transportation, but the basic distinction to make is, are you dependent on the automobile for all of your daily needs or most of your daily needs? And the typical household in suburbia, according to the traffic generation manuals that the city planners have to use, that typical household generates 13 one-way trips per day.
Wow.
Now, that means someone's not making it home at night, but I guess that's an average, right? Some homes are 12, some are 14. But those are trips not just to work and not just to school. Work probably for most people isn't walkable. School certainly should absolutely be walkable. For most people, it isn't. But it's trips to the corner store to get cat food, right? It's trips to the doctor's office. Me, I walk 5 minutes to my doctor's office. I should say right now I live in Brookline, Massachusetts, which is a very close-in streetcar suburb of Boston. It's actually surrounded on 3 sides by Boston. So I'm living, I made the choice, I had the luxury, the luck to be able to pick where I want to live in the Boston area, and we live in Brookline, where it's a town, but it's got a streetcar that runs straight into Boston. And so many of my daily needs, almost all of them, in fact, as you would find in a denser city, can be met on foot and by transit. And of course, the more transit you have, the more likely you are to have a walkable place. But the distinction really is whether you're depending on the automobile or not. I like to say, the automobile should be an instrument of freedom, not a prosthetic device. And for most of Americans, 30% of whom don't drive, they still rely on the automobile to get everywhere they're going.
So that's really interesting because when my wife and I left Maryland, we were living in Bowie, Maryland, which was largely suburban. We lived in a Levittown community.
Yep.
I rode my bike 11 miles to the research center, but I was taking my life into my hands for about an eighth of the time in that 11-mile ride because it wasn't set up for people to walk. In fact, you could not walk to the research center from my house. It would be illegal. And on a bike, it was quasi-legal. But when we moved to Brattleboro, a town of 13, we chose the house so that it was less than a mile and a half to every single need we had. Hospital, dentist, doctor, grocery store, school, and where I worked. And it's funny because Alex Wilson, who's the founder of Building Green, lives in Dummerston, which is a 7 to 8 mile trip from downtown. So they ride their bikes a lot, but it's not really walkable. It would be tough. So I've always been interested in the differences between the walkable nature of towns versus cities versus suburbs, and how, to me, there's a boundary condition again when we talk about transit and walking.
Yeah. Well, I always say, a walkable neighborhood doesn't need transit, but a walkable city relies on it absolutely, because if you don't connect the different walkable parts to each other, then those people who have the choice, and many don't, but those people who have the choice to live the walkable lifestyle will still buy a car, and they'll drive among those walkable places. And the more they drive, of course, the more those places shape themselves around people driving.
Yep.
And you end up with this sort of urban landscape in which those who don't have a choice are forced to find a way to drive, because the streets get wider, the walking gets worse, biking may not even be in the picture.
And Jeff, would you say that the good transit system is dependent on a walkable city, but probably not the other way around?
No, actually, it is the other way around.
Oh, yeah,
it depends.
Sorry. I did say it backwards.
One of the first things you learn in planning school, which I didn't go to, is that transportation systems beget settlement patterns. And once you have a good settlement pattern, that can then beget a better transportation system. But the history of the growth of cities around the world and in the U.S. is, you look at the transportation system, whether it's a port that is collecting, tall mast ships to do commerce, or it's, New York City, which also a port. But, New York City has more subway stops than all the other subway stops in America put together. That's why New York City is technically the most walkable location in the U.S. The more transit you have, the more density you have. It's an important distinction between a nodal structure of city and a dispersed structure. And what's remarkable about the automobile, for the first time, it was the first means of transportation really that was not nodal or linear. So you had ships, right, which collect in ports. Which of course privileged the coast, but nothing else. Then you had trains, heavy rail, with stops pretty far apart. And that's where you see the tremendous structure of like the Metro North line outside of New York City and all those towns in Westchester, which it connects, or San Francisco, for example, tremendous central business district, which is like an asterisk with trains reaching out in different directions to communities like Palo Alto. Actually, does it reach to Palo Alto? I think it does. I forget. I stayed in San Francisco. I believe it was in Palo Alto. Got on a heavy rail train, and it is, and came downtown to San Francisco. But then you had streetcars, and every city in America that was more than 10,000 people had streetcars at one point. They're almost all gone. Built almost entirely by developers to give value to land. So the developers had property. It was outside of town. They wanted people to move to those properties, and they built the streetcar line in order to get folks to have a convenient way to reach those places. But anywhere that was along the streetcar, and I see this also in the Boston area, the main streets the main corridors that run out of Boston into different neighborhoods are where the streetcars used to run. And so you may not have this nodal kind of asterisk type of city, but you have kind of a linear commercial. If you know, for example, you may not know Boston that well, but if you know Mass Ave in Cambridge, that runs from Cambridge, from Boston into Cambridge, out into Arlington, out into Lexington, it keeps going, and all the commercial is collected along that. And then, of course, the densities increase as you approach from the countryside. The densities increase the closer you get to that corridor, and so you have a city that looks more like a box of spaghetti or a piece of spaghetti with sauce around it. Only with the automobile did the whole landscape become equivalent. Anywhere you lay a thin strip of asphalt becomes just as reachable as anywhere else. And that meant that the communities could take this newly dispersed form where there was no reason to densify and no reason actually to create that sort of propinquity, that density of people and activity that has been shown to generate tremendous economic activity and production of patents and everything else. The denser you are, the more patents you generate per capita. There's all this great data like that shows there's tons of reasons why we come together at higher densities, but the one that made it necessary was a transportation system which has now been replaced.
Jake, I just learned 2 weeks ago that Brattleboro had a streetcar, and I was totally shocked because of that. There were probably only 10,000 people. Why did they set up a streetcar? And Jeff, you just confirmed that was the way that you developed land outside of town, basically?
And they were almost all they were for profit, and almost all developers. The original heavy rail subway lines you find in cities like New York and Boston were also created by private companies, but initially. But that was not so much developers as transportation investment.
So I actually, this seems like a good place to insert this. I love playing with walkscore.com. If you haven't been on walkscore.com, you can type in your address. There's a lot of information on there. It'll give you a walk score, a bike score. It'll give you time travel maps. So if you're thinking about buying a house and you're worried about your commute, it'll show you what you can get in 20 minutes or 20 minutes during rush hour. And so because I knew we were going to talk about this today, I played with Jeff because I have your address and Peter's address. And I had a theory, and that theory was proven true, but also altered. So the house that I'm building for myself in Columbia, Missouri, close to downtown, has a walk score of 35 and a bike score of 48. I was a little disappointed in the bike score because our community for 20 years has tried really hard to really encourage people to be on bikes and add bike lanes and bike trails, and the rail trails that went through town, or the rails that went through town are now trails, all that. Mm-hmm. And I felt like it should have been higher. Peter, your place in Brattleboro, Vermont, it was a walk score of 55 and a bike score of 27.
Ouch. Which
I was a little surprised by as well.
Yeah.
But then Jeff, and I'm guessing your scores already. It had a walking score of 88, a bike score of 67, and something that Peter and I didn't have, which is what we just talked about. You had a transit score of 67, and neither of us even had a transit score at all.
Right.
And I was really kind of blown away by that, and then I thought of Age of City, just like you were saying.
Well, my transit score should be higher because I can literally walk out the door 100 feet, hop on the green line, and within half an hour, well, actually within 15 minutes, I'm underground in Boston. And within half an hour, I'm at most of my destinations. But in fact, 88 is great, of course. I'm surprised it's not higher. I think first thing to say is that walk score is generally reliable. However, the algorithm is crap. The algorithm happens to work, but the algorithm measures what stuff you're near. And that's the only, unless they've changed it, and last I spoke to the founders, they haven't changed it. It measures, it has a list of stuff like supermarkets, restaurants, and everything else you might want proximity to, libraries, schools. And it measures how many of those things are near you and how close they are. And it almost always works because it turns out that how close you are to a mix of uses is a pretty good test as to whether you're living in the town model or the sprawl model. And I should say there are really only two tested ways to make community in the U.S. and pretty much around the world. I mean, there's 1,000 ways to make a town, but there's only two ways that we've tested by the thousands, and those are the traditional neighborhood and sprawl. And basically, until the First World War, almost everything we built was a traditional neighborhood, as in mixed use, walkable, and diverse. And then after that, almost everything we built wasn't, right? So it just so happens that those places in America that have high walk scores are also pre-war. And therefore they
pre-car.
have pre-car, and therefore they have the other stuff that actually makes a place walkable just by design. For example, is the street network a delicate and porous capillary system of small blocks, or is it what we call a dendritic system, a branching system of a sparse hierarchy that runs from local street to collector to arterial to highway? That's something that came with the sprawl model. Once we began to presume the automobile was the principal way of getting around, the street network model fell by the wayside and was replaced by this dendritic branching network where every trip basically goes from the local to the collector to the arterial to the highway and back again. And there really aren't, the blocks are if blocks exist at all, because there's lots of cul-de-sacs, they're quite large, the through streets. And in that model, walking tends to make so little sense anyway, because you have to go in kind of spirals. If you think about leaving the cul-de-sac, getting on the collector and the arterial to get to a friend's house on another cul-de-sac, a lot of the time you're going in the opposite direction of where and biking seems kind of stupid too, but you're rolling so easily because biking is so marvelous that it might be okay, but that made walking go away. The great irony of this dendritic system is that it was designed entirely around automobiles, but it's worse for automobiles because there's only one path from anything to anything else. So let's say you have an engine fire on your collector road. Well, your whole city basically shuts down for an afternoon. And we've also found that, because it's designed around its initial development pattern, so there's a certain number of roads, and then people put houses and shopping centers and office parks and other things on these roads, that the city can't grow. It can't become any more dense. Unlike our traditional cities, which have molted, from wooden shacks to brick 3-story buildings to, in many cases, 50-story towers, the block structure was able to handle those changes with grace, and they still function. But sprawl really can't grow up. As Andres Duany always says, it's doomed to permanently be wearing short pants because it's this child of a city. It's an inflexible and not a healthy network. But the thing the thing that's a little disappointing about walk score is that it could be so much more precise in terms of measuring the safety of walking along streets, the comfort of walking along streets, whether bike lanes and other things are present that make walking safer. Bike lanes make walking safer. And it doesn't, but it just happens to have lucked out to have found one variable that pretty much predicts all the others.
So,
go ahead, Peter.
Sorry. I was just going to say, when I was a kid and my grandparents were from the Delmarva Peninsula, Chesapeake Bay, you'd find 85-year-old men and women on a bicycle, going down the road. There's nobody in Brattleboro over 40 that rides a bike, and the difference is topography. The place where my grandmother grew up was dead flat, and Brattleboro is just full of hills. Now, I wanted to say, what's really changing that is electric bikes.
E-bikes. Yeah, absolutely.
You see these people, on their bicycle, they look like the witch from The Wizard of Oz, right? Because
Upright.
The level of effort they're pedaling with doesn't match their speed. So it's like,
right.
No.
Yeah, and they've got a kidnapped dog in a basket.
Yeah, exactly. But boy, it has totally changed. Now, the other thing I wanted to say, too, is the problem is winters. Like bicycling in Brattleboro in the winter, it's dangerous enough in good weather to bike in Brattleboro, but it's really dangerous to bike during the winter.
Yeah, I mean, so that aspect, that seasonal aspect is not going to change much. But e-bikes are changing.
Yeah.
And of course, the snowy days are really few, especially with climate change. But the e-bikes, I kind of resented e-bikes at first because I thought you had to work for it, and I was interested in the health aspects of biking around. And then I saw a study that demonstrated that people who use e-bikes get as much exercise as people who use regular bikes.
Seriously?
They just go further. They go further and faster, which made me super happy. Then you go to China, and I was in Beijing a year and a half ago, and you see there's actually this whole spectrum of bike, from plain old bike to e-bike to motorcycle. You know, there's a point at which you have to say you can't use the bike lane, right?
Right.
But it's tremendous, and of course the Chinese delivery people in large American cities have brought that technology in places like New York. De Blasio, who thinks he's green and isn't, was confiscating those bikes, and there's been a war on e-bikes. And I think we need to draw the line between where the bike ends and the motorcycle starts. But it's actually these forms of micro mobility are so healthy for cities and so good for getting greater mobility at lower cost and more efficiency of space, which is what cities are all about, and why cars kill cities is the space that they need, moving and parked. We can talk about that, but I'm a huge fan of the e-bike.
Hey, Jake, I wanted to ask, so in your work, Jeff, can you tell us a little bit about where you think the pressure points are for change? Like, who are your clients? How does that happen? Because Jake and I have it easy because we work on individual buildings, right? And that's actually complicated, but pretty easy. Working on a larger scale, I just don't understand how you do that and who your clients are.
Well, my clients come from all over the spectrum, and that's because city planning is a collaborative activity that includes cities, includes developers, but includes citizens and activists. And so sometimes when I'm brought into a place, it's because of grassroots folks who look more like you guys, who are advocating for more bikeability, more walkability, more sustainable living, or for traffic safety, because often the way that most people intersect with city planning in a way that it could make their lives better or worse has to do with what the streets are like around their homes and the places they work and spend their time. That's often folks who bring me in to advocate in communities. When I'm working in communities, it may be for a city client or a developer client, but the planning process these days is necessarily a collaborative one, because if there are people who are against the project, the sooner you wrap them in, the less likely they are to derail the project. And of course, they can derail the project at the approvals stage, where they show up in disproportionate numbers as NIMBYs at hearings, or they can sue it after it's passed. They can sue it and slow it down for long enough to kill it, and that happens very often. And so another way that planning has changed, the practice of planning has changed in the quarter century that I've been involved, not just from sprawl to back to town again, but from kind of private back room, smoke-filled room sessions to this out in the open public planning process that my mentors also popularized as the charrette. You may have probably heard this term, the planning charrette, which actually it was Andres and Liz, my mentors, who turned that into a term of popular consumption, where we're going to, and we did this, I did it at their firm for 10 years, we're going to bring a whole team of planners to your town. We're going to stay there for a whole week. We're going to have open doors every day. We're going to have presentations every 2 days. We're going to have multiple feedback loops, and we're going to help you shape the community that's forming near you. That's been the way that planning happens. So, it's almost unheard of these days that places get planned without a lot of public input. The challenge then has been to make that public input representative, because what tends to happen is the only people who show up, the people who have the time to show up, right? The people who aren't working two shifts, the people who care because it's going to impact their quality of life, are the people who live immediately adjacent. And so the typical scenario in almost every project I'm working on is you have a project which meets the planning goals of the city, which acknowledges that the city, that everyone in the city agrees that we need more housing, that we need more affordability, that we need more transit-oriented development, that the city in its planning documents that were created through a very public and shared process acknowledges that it wants these things. and you come forward with a project that exactly epitomizes the stated and affirmed planning goals of the city that's in its comprehensive plan, and 60% or more of the people who show up are fighting the project. Because yes, we want all those things, we just don't want them near us. And the fact is that, the NIMBY is a specialist in what's best for their backyard or front yard, NIMFY. But they are acting in their own self-interest, and often in their enlightened self-interest. But if it's a tragedy of the commons situation, if every neighborhood gets what it wants, then the city doesn't get what it wants as a city. And by that I mean the all the people.
People as
right?
well.
The polis. The polis does not get what the polis wants if each individual subdivision next to a planning site meets what its neighbors want. And so that's the classic crisis in planning, which we try to work around by more sophisticated techniques like interactive digital polling. But then, most developers I know use much more tried and tested techniques like going around the neighborhoods, all the neighborhoods of the city, and really working hard to convince people to show up at hearings so that you get some sort of representative population.
I can't imagine a job where public hearings are a regular part of my...
And they're always at
sounds
night.
like a nightmare.
Well, I got to tell you, it's a little easier now with COVID and Zoom, because at least we can do it from our homes.
Yeah.
And people tend to be a little more civil, interestingly, not sure why. They tend to be a little more civil, so far at least, on Zoom hearings than on in public hearings.
Oh, that's fascinating. Hey, just a real quick plug that you have on your website, like a 15-minute video on sort of transportation and COVID, and particularly about temporary blocking of streets and how it's done both officially and unofficially. That was fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
Well, that's the planning challenge that most communities are facing right now, is a spatial crisis on our sidewalks, at least in downtown areas, where you have all these competing interests. You have people walking who want to maintain 6 feet, should maintain 6 foot distances. You have people waiting in line to get into stores. You have people doing restaurant pickup. You have restaurants that want to expand onto the sidewalk.
Absolutely.
You have joggers who still are going to jog. And you've got people who won't take public transportation who are actually trying out biking for the first time. And I've seen a lot of really bad bikers in my neighborhood recently, because that's the way they get to work, and they got a bike, and now they're doing that. And so there's a number of techniques that have been well documented. And yes, at jeffspeck.com, JEFFSPECK.com, you can find a video where I talk about that. There's techniques of closing streets to cars so people have places to recreate, but more often it's about expanding sidewalks, particularly into 4-lane roads that could be 2-lane roads, or removing the parking, or doing both, removing a lane of driving and a lane of parking. In my hometown of Brookline, we've taken the parking lane, pushed it into the outer travel lane, the outer driving lane, and widened our sidewalks into what was the parking lane, for example. But maybe 500 cities and towns in the U.S. have done it so far, and it's a huge change that's underway. I also would call attention to people. You mentioned, I thought you were going somewhere else. On my website, there are 2 TED Talks about the walkable city, and one is why the walkable city is so important, and the other is how to do it in your community. Obviously, you won't learn how to do it entirely in 15 minutes, but those two talks together have been viewed like 4 million times. So people like them, and they're a great way to share this conversation.
But it's a fantastic introduction.
And your video on the COVID, just as a segue to what you're talking about hearings, that is a recording from a committee hearing, isn't it, Jeff?
Yeah, the Boston City Council was trying to convince the mayor to become a leader on this issue. He was dragging his feet. He says, "I'm just a car guy," even though he's quite progressive and really wonderful mayor. But he was really not focusing on this in a proactive way. And the city council decided to hold a hearing and made it very clear. They had they passed a resolution that they were going to have a hearing on COVID-safe streets, and I ended up being the kickoff speaker. But as things happen in city politics, the morning of the hearing, because the hearing was about to happen, the mayor sent out a tweet storm about how he was going to make COVID-safe streets, and that was the beginning of one. It worked, right? So now Boston
cool.
is a leader in making this happen, and you may have seen in the North End the famous Little Italy that we have in Boston. Hanover Street, the parking has all been replaced by dining, and some of the smaller side streets have been closed and have become outdoor restaurants, and they're quite beautiful. And people all over the country were tweeting this and saying, "This isn't Europe, this is Boston. We should do this," which was pretty cool.
That's really cool. Downtown Brattleboro a couple of times has closed off the main street to traffic, and it completely changes the nature of the downtown, and the merchants love it. Because
it's a city by city thing, and of course this was a huge movement in the 60s through 80s, really. More than 200 main streets in the U.S. were closed, and of course Burlington, Vermont's wonderful main street, and there's about 20 of them that are fantastic, and they're almost all in university towns or resort towns like Miami or Madison or Boulder. About 180 of them failed. And it's important to understand that and understand why. Not to not do it. Cities should absolutely do it. But to do it the right way, which is how Jeanette Sadiq-Khan introduced it to New York about 5 years ago, which is to make it temporary and test it. First you do it for a Saturday, then you do it for a weekend. Then if it's working, you just keep doing it, expand the hours. But what we did in the 60s through the 80s was, and by we I don't mean me, is very expensively with huge federal grants and state grants, made it impossible to let cars into the streets, and absolutely transformed, in many cases, main streets that were relying on people driving up and shopping into places where nobody shopped, and the place died. And so absolutely we should be making parts of our city pedestrian only, but you need to do it cautiously and not slowly, but very quickly, but with tactical urbanism, that's reversible. And just try it out. And it's amazing the degree to which cities aren't willing to just try things. And I'm always telling people, don't do a study, because so much of the money spent in planning is doing studies, and they always cost at least $40,000. Everything I propose, let's do a study. I'm like, no, don't do a study, do a test. Lay it out. Bring a police car in, see what happens. Don't study it, test it for the cost of a patrol guy who's got to be out there anyway doing something.
Well, Jake's going to laugh at this, but I love testing. Right?
Peter does his own testing. Same here. We my favorite motto is trust but verify. The bicycle thing that you were just talking about is it struck home. We're within a couple months of moving, and my wife said, I'm going to replace my bicycle because we're going to ride our bikes a heck of a lot more at the new house. And she called the bike store that's closed because of COVID, and they said 3 months before we have another bike that fits.
I've been hearing about that. Hey, can we talk about where the real intersection is? And you hinted at it in our lead-in. But the real intersection in our work is with this confusion about what makes a sustainable building.
Perfect.
And
good segue.
In Walkable City, I have this chapter called The Wrong Color Green. And like most of my writing, I learned most of it from other people. In this case, from David Owen, who you may know. He wrote a book called Green Metropolis. David Owen's a New Yorker writer. He's just a great writer. Like Jane Jacobs, I say, a mere writer. And he just did a ton of research and wrote an incredibly captivating and easy to read and fun to read book called Green Metropolis. And my chapter learned a ton from him. This is one thing I didn't learn from him, however, which is this idea of location efficiency. And location efficiency, the EPA for many years has had a community design branch. I'm not sure what its status is these days because it's not really the EPA anymore. But the idea of location efficiency and how something that we planners have been carping about for years, which is, as you suggested, everyone looks at the building itself, but not where it's located, and the indirect, I guess you could say indirect, expenditure on energy and the resultant pollution that happens when a building is located in a strictly drivable location. And so I talk about this one EPA study that was called Location Efficiency and Building Type, boiling it down to BTUs. And the study compared 4 factors. It was drivable versus walkable location, conventional construction versus green building, single-family versus multifamily housing, and conventional versus hybrid automobiles. So, are you driving a gas guzzler or a hybrid? It's clear that every factor counts, but the study showed that walkability was by far the biggest impact on how much these buildings were contributing to climate change. Specifically, in drivable locations, it found that transportation energy consistently tops household energy use. So, and often more than 2 to 1 or 2.5 to 1. So the big takeaway for me was that the most green house, right, the greenest house with a Prius, you got the solar panels, you got the Prius. Back then, when it was done, they weren't really all electric, which I'm sure has some impact. But the greenest house with the Prius in sprawl still lost out.
Yeah, was
more polluting than the least green home with a regular old gas guzzler in a walkable neighborhood. So there's nothing you can do to make your house more green than to have it be in a walkable neighborhood. And of course, it's much better if it's an apartment versus a freestanding house for a number of reasons. One reason is, in an apartment, you're heating and cooling your neighbor when the hot and the cold escape your apartment, they're helping someone else as opposed to just going straight into the atmosphere. The other thing, and David Owen dwells on this in his book, is that we just live our life larger when we have more room. So it isn't just that we're driving to where we live, but we're not parking the car in the garage. We're parking the car in the driveway, and we're filling the garage. This is now my line. We're filling the garage with all those things we need to buy to make up for the fact that we have such a sad and anonymous life in the suburbs. So the community we lack, the community that we lack by not being in a more urban location, we replace with toys. And our garage is full of toys that we need to entertain ourselves because we don't have that those third places, that public space and realm that people usually enjoy before and after work, mostly after work. But that we just live larger when we have more space. We consume more, and of course the ways that the cities subsidize the suburbs in terms of the cost of sewage lines and the cost of the electrical grid, and the fact that and there's an amazing guy named Chuck Maroon and the whole Strong Towns movement, and you should talk to him and go to strongtowns.org to learn about this. But he's an engineer who discovered some years ago that a house on a cul-de-sac just doesn't pay for itself in terms of taxes. I mean, just the paving of the road, which has to happen every 20 or 30 years, the taxes from the houses over those 20 or 30 years isn't enough to pay just for that. Forget about schools and everything else. So we have this condition where we've been subsidizing in so many ways the suburban experience to the detriment of our downtowns that are paying extra. That, of course we've made the wrong choices about where to live because of the costs associated with those choices.
Wasn't there was a program, I don't know if it still exists, for location efficient mortgages?
Yes.
That probably used that score.
I haven't looked at it recently, but banks would consider your location in giving you a mortgage, principally because they're looking at the back ratio of your debts and
exactly.
Are you going to be owing money not just on the house but on other stuff like multiple automobiles. Yeah. And very often, a typical suburban house will have more automobile debt than real estate debt.
Yeah.
Very interesting. That's very interesting. Okay, so the long and short of it is we got to pick where we put our buildings in a more responsible manner, and we have to make our choices.
But also the long and short of it is that most Americans don't have the choice, right? I mean, most Americans are driving till they qualify, is the term that we use. Mm-hmm. And that the way that we've organized our cities over time, the way that we've robbed transit of investment, the way that we don't think twice about adding a lane to a road or adding 20 miles to a highway, has created a situation where the only affordable housing in many larger cities is at a place which you can only drive to. And unfortunately, people make the choice about where to live based on the cost of the house, and they don't always factor in the cost of transportation. They don't always factor in the cost of the commute and all the time that they're spending getting to work and back and getting to other things and back. Even back in the 1970s, the intellectual multinational writer Ivan Illich found out that and he wrote about how if you add, and this was when people were spending half as much time driving, but if you added to the time of your commute the time that you spent working to buy the car and put gas in the car and pay the insurance in the car, we're basically moving around our cities at 3 to 4 miles an hour, which is the speed of walking. So, and I like to say in my lectures, what we've accomplished between 1970 and now, when Ivan Illich was writing, is we basically doubled the miles of roadway in our country. And as a result, we've doubled the percentage of our income that we spend on transportation. So we used to spend a dime on the dollar on transportation back in the 70s. The typical American family now spends 20 cents on the dollar, because we as a nation made the choice to tie transportation to the most inefficient, most expensive, most wasteful form of transportation. So, yes, as home builders, you and your audience should be focusing on more urban locations to give healthier, more sustainable, lives to the people who are going to occupy those homes. But there's a much larger effort that needs to happen, which is happening, which is the local and regional advocacy for those things that make walkable settlements more possible and more attainable. And by the way, the number one thing, and many cities, many normal cities like Des Moines, for example, are doing this, is they are actively investing in bringing more attainable housing downtown. So if you want to convert an abandoned loft into a 100-unit apartment house in Des Moines, you get a 10-year tax abatement, and you get another 10 years of tax increment financing, and basically it means that you can provide units that people can afford. And then, of course, we're also getting rid of those ridiculous rules that make inner-city housing so expensive, like apartment size minimums, which are nothing but exclusionary zoning, to keep things around rich people, and parking minimums. And that's
parking requirements.
That's a huge shift that's happening in some cities, is lightening the parking requirements around new construction, which can reduce the cost by 20-30%, and also bring people there who self-select to walk around your neighborhood instead of driving around your neighborhood. So there's all these moves afoot. I would say we just need more. I've kind of given up on national leadership and even state leadership. There's, our fundamental system of government with the way that campaigns are financed is fundamentally corrupt. It's what, 50 years ago would have been considered pure corruption, and now we've just kind of put it aside. But it means that we can't get real leadership at the federal level and very little at the state level. But at the local level, mayors and town meetings and, selectmen are making good choices. And city by city, we're seeing a lot of positive changes happening.
So on a positive note, Jeff, maybe to wrap up, is your new book, which is about walkable city rules, that's more of a how-to for almost anybody, builder, community member, developer, to look at how to make change happen?
Everything I write is for everybody. That's that's the niche I've chosen. But the way I distinguish it is if you want to understand, first of all, if you want to have a good, fun, nonfiction beach read that will explain to you why walkability is so important and the basics of how to get it done, or if you want to convince other people, and that's most of my audience is people convincing other people who are buying boxes of the book and distributing them, Walkable City is the book for that. Walkable City is, and I say this just quoting Planning Magazine, Walkable City is the book for getting planning discussions to happen positively in your city. Walkable City Rules was written for people who are doing the work. That doesn't mean you're a professional. You could be an activist or someone just who cares about their street. But it's 101 two-page rules with illustrations, graphs. Each rule, a typical rule would be make parklets, which is a discussion of turning parking spaces into these little decks that people dine on. Each rule you can lay it on the photocopy machine and and put it up and send it to anyone you want, or better yet, scan it and send it to people in an email. But it breaks it down into a bunch of easy to take steps that actually give you measurements and other stuff that allow you to get it done.
Well, I think Jeff qualifies as a real unbuild it cast member.
I agree. Thank you so much, Jeff, for joining us on the podcast today. This is fantastic,
Thanks,
man.
Jeff.
I'm really happy.
Well, you can thank my family for abandoning the cabin and leaving it to me.
Yes.
And
they're probably
let me know
out
when it's
walking.
out, and let me know when it's out, and I'll share it with my audience. And I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Okay, until next time, everybody check out all 3 of Jeff's books. Check out the TED Talks that Peter noted, and I am going to go to Jeff's website and look at the COVID video now. Thank you, guys. We'll see you again soon.
Thanks.